Welcome, Mr. Alesbury. Take it away.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to come talk to you folks. Jason. There are just a few things I wanted to talk about, which I had broached with Adam earlier in one form or fashion or another. And it's really to talk about a few things, but I'm wide open to having the conversation go in any direction that you folks might have an interest in taking it. But what I wanted to come and discuss was, to basically give you a thumbnail sketch, which I'm sure you're in many respects very familiar with, the funding and spending challenges CPC has been faced with over the last 3 years. And just as importantly, some of the work that we've been doing starting over a year ago to address the issues we're faced with. How do we stretch the dollars we've got, and do we need to raise the surcharge? And most importantly, how can FinCom help us as we go forward? So, as I said, back in the fall of last year, independent of, interesting, that little window's up there. Independent of everything except for the simple fact that for a couple of years, oh, okay. Well, that's not all bad. For the last 3 years, we've been facing significant oversubscription, i.e., a lot more requests for funds than we have funds available. And so the first order of business in the best practices research that we commissioned was to address, is there anything we can do with the money we currently have to stretch it further? Because there are a lot of practices that have been in place for a number of years, and I'm not sure too many folks on the committee have looked at them or thought about them and thought about tweaking them and turning some of the dials a little bit to see if we can stretch the dollars we currently have. And secondly, doing the research had to do with, well, even if those turning of the dial options weren't enough to cover the gaps, if we were to advocate for a surcharge increase, how much should it be? And when do we think we need it by? Easy to ask that question, hard to answer it. But this picture is just meant to show that for each of the last 3 years, we were basically oversubscribed by about $1 million. And interestingly, in each of those 3 years, we have had one single very large project that made up the lion's share of the applications. And within the application submission date and the review, each one of those applications was radically altered before we had the review with the committee, and reduced, cut back, I think in large part because the prevailing wisdom was it wasn't going to get funded at the current level because everybody knew how short we were. So there was a resubmission of each one of those large projects, and the funding level that was provided basically was covered with the funding we did have. If we after the revisions, but before we funded less, a 2% surcharge would have covered the revised applications in each of the 3 years, with give or take a few dozen $1,000s. And without any project revisions, a 2.5% surcharge would have covered 100% of all the applications as originally received. So that's just an interesting little factoid that I felt was important for us to understand as a committee before we did anything. So the next couple slides, I'm not going to bore you with the details of our best practices research, but I just wanted to give you a quick overview that we covered a lot of territory. It was about 16 or 17 towns, and covered a number of different topics. And this slide is not meant to be read, so it's not an accident. I don't want to bore, as I said, don't want to bore you with the details, but we covered a lot of ground. And we started with a structural approach towards, how is the availability of information that CPC makes open to the public? How do we compare to other towns? Are we as transparent as we can be and as we should be? Are there any meeting mechanics, the way we run our operation, run the meetings and the process of dealing with our funding? Are there any mechanics we do that are different from other towns? Are other towns doing things that are different that might be useful to us? So we kind of took that approach on the one hand and got into a variety of towns, and it became a bit of a, I won't say a random walk, but it was hard to avoid the, geez, that's interesting. You dive a little bit deeper and you look a bit, and before you know it, you're off into a completely different tangent, sometimes bearing no fruit whatsoever, but other times giving us some pretty useful insights. The first and the only instance I'll bore you with related to the town of Bedford. First off, they had an interesting little feature. They have a 3% surcharge every year on their town warrant. They put it up for reaffirmation. Do we want to keep the 3%? Do we want to drop it? So I thought that was interesting. I'm not saying that's a great idea we should endorse, but it was very different from any of the other towns in the study. Bedford also does a 6-year plan. There was one other town that hinted at it, but Bedford was really quite straightforward about it, that they wanted to collect from all the participating entities across the town who have made submissions in the past to please give a projection over the upcoming 6 years, not for any other purpose, but then to advise the CPC what level of resources might be needed. There would be no penalty for not submitting anything in the 5-year or 6-year plan, nor any indication of, I mean, there's no benefit in terms of ultimate applications received. They would have to stand and fall on their own merits, but it was just meant to be a forward-looking view. The previous slide, when I look back over the last 3 years and showed the shortfall, that's looking through the rearview mirror. I was immediately struck by Bedford's orientation towards looking forward over 5 or 6 years and trying to get ahead of the curve and see where the landscape is changing, for better or for worse. So anyway, we did a fair amount of that, looked at things like the exemption rules, how well are our terms around offering exemptions to our citizens, how do they compare to other towns? Are we as lenient or as conservative as other towns? And it turns out we're right smack dab in the middle. Interestingly, I did a further dive and I found out that the rough estimate for the amount of participation for the number of households that qualify in this town for low-income exemptions of the CPA surcharge, the participation rate is less than 10%. So that was striking in its own sense. I have no knowledge as to what other towns' level of participation is. I do know that 1 or 2 other towns offer online applications for the exemptions. Acton does not. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. The key takeaways that we summarized that I'm in the process of implementing, not too surprisingly, is we're doing a 5-year plan. I did it somewhat hesitantly because I wasn't sure how well received it would be, how onerous people would tend to regard it as, and it's been, to a person, received with enthusiasm and willingness and encouragement. So I'm gratified by the willingness of the town participants to provide that perspective. And much of the information is already in hand. Not all of it is. But the intention will be every year we're going to put this into our CPA plan that we publish as a formal document. So we will have the latest view annually updated as to what we think, what we've been told are the expected future requirements of CPC. It's just a projection. It's good for the day it's created. Things change. Nobody expects it to materialize as it's laid there, but it's a forward-looking view. We're also taking steps to improve the CPA tax exemption offering. I do have, I didn't mention, but one of the previous slide had indication of how administrative support costs are funded. And Acton is a little bit of an outlier relative to many of the other towns. It's small money, it's not a big deal, but it's not something that the committee has really looked at and thought through. Is this the methodology we want to employ? And so we're working through that. Not because we want to defund anything, we just want to make sure we're clear as to what it is we are funding and why we're funding it. And the prevailing practice across all these towns that were studied is it's about incremental CPC-driven costs that get paid for. And that seems appropriate to us, to me. We haven't really finished the discussion that's ongoing in the committee itself. One of the other things that we're doing is we're implementing measures to improve the chances of the success rate of large projects. Projects above a certain dollar amount, we want to make sure that those are previewed with a CPC before the application submission date. We also want to make sure so that we can give feedback and say, well, this is a big one, and here are the, here's the advice we might have as to how to modify the application to improve its chances of being funded. Secondly, we want to make sure that any application revision is done with the consent of the committee so that we're not reviewing and preparing off of one set of documents and then being presented a different set of documents when the review occurs. And it's bolded in red. I don't think you can see it quite clearly, but one of the primary reasons why I'm here is I want to, and I've asked this of Adam, and he's been very supportive. Conceptually, is we want to make sure that for those large projects with complex financials, that we ask the FinCom to weigh in and to do some vetting, because I think it will add some strength and credibility to the judgments that we do come to. I think the committee is, the CPC is well skilled and experienced across all of the domains. There is a financial dimension that I think intersperses throughout each one of those, and that's the expertise and the discipline I want to make sure is continuously available to the committee on an as-needed basis. So that's the key ask. I'll show you a couple more details what I mean when I say that. I also we're going to be modifying the meeting mechanics. We're trying to strengthen and broaden the role of the domain leads. When I say domain leads, CPC, as I'm sure you're well aware, is community housing, open space, recreation, and historic preservation. Those are the four main areas that are qualified fundable applications. And each one is a domain, and we have committee liaisons to various and sundry committees on our committee who represent historic and recreation and open space and community housing. And so I'm just, the key takeaway I got from the study was other towns have much more responsibility on those people who I'm calling domain leads to basically be sponsors for the work that's going on in that space and to be spokespersons for them. Our work is not just about reviewing applications at the point of receipt. It's about monitoring progress after awards and to perform postmortems after they're completed. What did we learn? What worked well? What didn't? How can we improve the process? And the domain leads should be playing an important part to strengthen that process. Not a lot of work, I don't think, but it's really trying to strengthen the four corners of what we're about. And bonding. I say bonding because I've been very interested in understanding how certain towns pay for large land purchases with small surcharge levels. And it doesn't always come down to bonding, but bonding is a clear element. And Acton is a participant, has been a participant in it, but it's something that, it's a lever that we need to be able to assess how appropriate is it for a given application, for a given land purchase? And what does it mean to us in terms of our future financial obligations to service that debt. How much of a consumption, what percent consumption does it equate to of the total spending we have on a given year? And can we afford it? Questions like that. So, yeah, and to this day, I don't understand, and maybe somebody has got familiar knowledge of how Concord does it, but I do want to reach out to them. They have large parcels of open space, and they have 0 bonds, and they make no discernible, based on my own research, it's entirely possible I've just missed it all, but there's no evidence of CPC funding an open space set-aside fund on a material level that enables them to make land purchases. So, whereas other towns, some towns have got $20 million worth of debt. We have 1 of CPC debt. So anyway, that's a mystery I'm going to pursue the answer to. When it comes to vetting of projects, an example that I'm looking to be able to sustain is work I did 2 years ago on a large project that came in. And it's, again, this is not about reviewing the details. I can't even read it myself. But this was a side-by-side comparison of 2 different iterations, the original application and the one that arrived the 2 days before the review. And there's no way I was going to let that just pass without saying, so how did this change and why did it change and does it make sense? Do the numbers add? Simple things. And there were a lot of questions that never got answered satisfactorily before other issues became every bit as binding. But the point here is this is the kind of financial vetting I want to make sure doesn't necessarily rely on the skills of one individual who happens to be on the CPC at the time that the application comes in. It's the level of rigor that when it's appropriate, I would be very hopeful that we could reach out to the CPC, because I'm working under the presumption that that skill set is in varying degrees collectively present here. And so it's, Roland, I know you've been on the committee for a long time, but you know, our meeting schedules are not lining up, you know, helpfully in that they're exactly the same dates of every meeting. So it's hard. But in any event, I don't mean to not rely on you and the role that you've played in the past, but it's becoming not as easy as I wish it were. And I want to make sure that you understand that I'm looking for financial skills and rigor to be applied on large projects, and maybe even small ones that are complicated that you know, we don't necessarily have the background for. I don't want to be the only one to be doing this, because I have confidence in the work I do, but I don't think I should be the only one to say, I think there's a mistake. It'd be great to have strength in the participation of FinCom in this. That's going back in time. I mentioned the open space purchases. The 5-year plan that we're in the process of assembling, the inputs we've already received from open space indicates that there are a couple large purchases coming up. We've got about I think it's 1.3, should know that number, just over $1 million in the open space set-aside fund right now. Parcel A, sometime in fiscal year 23, $2.2 million. Parcel B, sometime maybe in FY24, $3.9 million. That shoe doesn't fit. I mean, there's no way in our current financial level of funding we're going to be able to afford this and do the other things we want to do. So it begs the question that I've been kind of very much interested in, is to understand the bonding implications. And so I have looked at this based on my own knowledge. I am very familiar with bonding structures, so it's not outside of my area of expertise. And I've done some of the math, and this is just one page of what is pretty much a 7 or 8 page layering of the logic I've used that I want before I go anywhere. I've come to the conclusion we can afford to do this with bonding of a certain level, based on the terms that are in place today with the Piper Road bond. That's it, 15 years to 5%, and that's, so I'm just using that as a guide and laying it out over time. And the consumption, the amount of funding that we would be devoting to interest payments is 20%, which is not that bad. It's 8% today. But it's no point in talking to these details. The point here is, and I put this to Adam, and I have no preference for where the skill set comes from, but the work that's been done, it leads me to want to make a conclusion before I do in broader form. I'd really love to hear the wisdom of this committee, or a member of this committee, or a subset of this committee say yes, no, or maybe not over here because there's a mistake made, or a logic issue. So it's the vetting of large, complex financial dimensions of this work that I want to institutionalize over time, because I'm not going to be on the committee forever. So that's basically my ask, but I'm open to any other comments. That's basically it.
Thank you, Mr. Alesbury. We'll open this up to comments and questions here, and I think I'll start by just saying that when Bill came to me and said, would it be possible for us to put some of our larger requests before the FinCom for their consideration, I thought that was really a good idea. I think it goes part and parcel with our, or at least with my view of the FinCom really being a service-oriented entity within the town that the town and other committees within the town should rely upon for, as Bill put it, vetting of certain projects, or at least an opinion on. I have to say I'm really pleased with the idea of having a 5-year plan. The town has done a great job of coming up with a 10-year capital plan. The school has, I think, at least a 5-year capital plan. This all really helps the ALG process, right? And I think for you guys to be able to come to us with that will help the FinCom be able to speak, even in our point of view, too, when we go speak with all the entities, saying, here are all of the costs, wants, needs, other things that are coming down the pipe, and if you add them all up, here's what our future tax bill is going to be, and which really helps, I think, the citizens make decisions about what they want. And so at this point, I think I'd like to just open this up to any Q&A from members. Mr. Noon.
Okay. Well, hi, Bill. It's been a while.
Yeah, Pete.
I'll work backwards. My background, before there was a Roland, there was me. I was FinCom liaison for CPC for several years. So what I know about it is old, then so am I. So as far as bonding goes, it's been talked about as long as there's been a CPC. For the benefit of the FinCom members, it would not be anything but a general obligation bond to the town. And the only tie that it has to CPC funding is, as Bill pointed out in the Bedford example, if the town ever voted to get rid of the CPC.
Yeah, you can't until the bond's paid.
The bond continues. Just so if you can vote away the revenue, but you can't vote away the cost. So it will stay for whatever the 15 or 20 years you're going to have. I guess if I go way, way back to the days of the original Leary Field and things like that, two things were better than today. The state match was bigger, much bigger. It was 100% a couple of years. And the applicants contributed significant pieces of the funding. Money was raised, Larry Field probably about a third of that money was raised from different sports leagues. And that was kind of the early model of the applicants would come and they would have to produce a significant piece of the funding, and then CPC would kick in the rest. My impression over the last few years is we don't see much of that anymore. The other impression I have is that we have a lot of governmental units looking for funding as opposed to community groups. I don't know what the percentages are as compared to what they used to be. I do know that open space and recreation are by far the most popular projects you can have. If you go way back to when this was first voted by the town, I'm guessing 3/4 of the people thought they were voting for open space purchases and probably nothing else. The historical preservation, the affordable housing have never been as popular with the voters. But there is a 10% requirement. And then some years we don't get there. So you have to have set-asides. As far as increasing the percentage from 1.5 to 2 or 2.5, I'll reserve judgment, but it's a tough year to go for it.
I'm not asking for an opinion on the surcharge.
Well, I'm giving you one anyway. But
No, but it's premature.
I will say that, I won't speak for Adam, but this committee is pretty good at putting ad hoc groups together for short-term projects. So if you have something that needs a thorough vetting, then it's usually not a problem. And no, Roland shouldn't be stuck with all the work. Okay.
Mr. Cole?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I definitely love the idea of the FinCom getting involved early. I just want to reiterate that. Allows us not only to be collaborative about where things are going, but more importantly, it avoids any of those end-of-year surprises where we get the list of CPC 5 weeks before town meeting. There's something on it that we absolutely hate, and that sets up an us versus them kind of argument at town meeting, which there's no reason to do. So getting involved early would be wonderful, and I'm all for it. Similarly, I love the idea of a 5-year plan. Being able to spread things out over time is a great idea. As for bonding, I think you should take it on an as case-by-case basis. When you're able to get your 5% coupon at 2.25, 2.5, then absolutely bonding is by far the most advantageous way of doing it. But we could be heading into years where we'd be lucky to get something at 6 or 7, in which case maybe it's not exactly the right path. You may not be asking for an opinion on greater surcharges, but you're going to get another one. I think it undermines the need to be careful. I think, as you have shown in your own examples, so many of these projects come in and they have an initial ask, but then they see the oversubscription and they go, okay, well, maybe I don't really need that much. So for all those projects that came back with smaller asks, if there had been no constraint, then there would have been no reason to hone the original ask. So I think it's important not to just have too big a pot to begin with. Similarly, I'd be concerned that with a large pot of money, people just ask more right from the start. In any negotiation, it's not uncommon to ask for more than you really need so that you can be seen conceding down to what you really need. So I'd be cautious about deciding to ask for a larger surcharge. I, for one, am not supportive of it at this time. The other thing that I would like to comment on, this is a corollary to what Mr. Noon said, but I just want to try and put it out there, try and say it in a slightly different way. One of the points that you made was that you were thinking about trying to shift some of the administrative costs to the town budget, and I'm assuming that would also fall then onto the workload of some of the town officials. And I believe that that could have the negative impact of just two things, shifting the cost from one entity to the other. And once it's in the town office, it's actually a little easier to get glossed over or buried in the weeds because it's part of a larger budget and there's a little less discipline on just the aspects of what the CPC cost would be. I also think that it would take away from some of the grassroots nature of what the CPC is supposed to be, and this is where I'm corollary to what Mr. Noon said. This would just become just another funding source for the town priorities and not necessarily for the volunteer people that are on the CPC. So I would kind of like to see I'd like to see a continuation of the distinction between the volunteer nature of CPC and the priorities of the town professionals. The town volunteers are tasked with driving the best use of the CPC monies. And if you foist it off onto town employees, it becomes the town's responsibility, and it undermines the requirements to get the significant leverage from the people asking for it, because it then becomes, well, it's the town's responsibility, it falls to all 26,000 of us, versus a group that has a need and just needs a little extra to get there. So I'd be very cautious about just shifting it over to the town. I don't think that's necessarily the right path. So I'd be cautious about that. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, let me interject here quickly and ask Mr. Alesbury if you could explain to the board the current administrative cost transfer that takes place between the CPC and the town.
Yeah, it's up until 2021, it was automatically a 5%. That's the maximum allowable by the CPA. And there has been a spreadsheet that has existed since as long as I know, that lays out the planning department's hours of support, direct support to the CPC committee. It then has a column that lays out hours of time by the town manager's office, hours, rate, assistant manager, assistant, so on and so forth. And then the finance department, the tax assessor. And then there was a bottom line category called legal. Based on the analysis I did or the research I did of the various towns, first off, none had an automatic 5%. Nothing is returned at the end of the season. Almost all of them had the equivalent of the planning department's direct support, the people who actually attend our meetings and who do all the work that we need in order to complete our tasks using their offices. So that was about 15 to 20,000 of the 60 that we pay. But no other towns had that I was able to find. I don't mean to make a blanket statement that's absolutely true. Based on the research completed, no other town that I was able to find charges for the overhead cost of the town manager's office. No other town has a surcharge, bad choice of words, a burden for the finance department and the tax assessors. Every town, almost every town, had direct labor support, dues for membership fees. We don't cover that. There's about a $3,500 fee, I think, for being in the Community Preservation Coalition, which is a useful, incredibly valuable organization. We leverage their skills and knowledge base all the time. We don't pay for that. I think we should. Signage, meetings, et cetera. There are certain incremental costs that many towns itemize, and the rules of the CP Coalition stipulate that direct salaries, no problem, but all other indirect costs, all other expenses incurred in support of the committee, such as legal, membership fees, signage, et cetera, those go into a pot that once the year is over, if that pot has not been fully consumed, it reverts back to the general fund. And I'm not interested in reducing the $60,000 admin fee. The point is, do we know what we're paying for, and does it line up with what other towns are? Does it follow the advice of the coalition? And I think it's pretty much askew from those guidelines. And I think we should realign them. So I'm not trying to take money away from the town. I think that's secondary. I know we're paying, we used to pay 5%. It's been reduced to 3.5. It worked out to 3.5 last year. That made us the third most expensive town relative to the study I did. Some towns pay 0. Some towns pay 1%. Most of them have a section of funds that are put into a bucket, and once the year is over, whatever is left unspent reverts back to the general fund, period, full stop. I think we should be doing something like that. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to defund the town or cause a budget issue. I just think we have had this mechanical process. The spreadsheet I referred to that had those 3 columns, you need 7 screens to read it. And I'm the only one who's read it. I'm certain of it in the last 5 years. And every time I go into it, it drives me crazy. It's so cryptic, it's so difficult to understand, much less make sense of. And I think it's in the grand scheme, it's not a hill I want to die on. It's not important enough. It just bothers me that we haven't looked at it, and we should just review it and refresh the rationale for why we should be paying what we're paying.
And to clarify, Bill, when you say at the end, if there was money unspent, it goes back to the general fund, you mean the general fund of the town or back
No.
to the CPC general fund? Thank you. Mr. Nin?
Yeah, the administrative charges have been kind of a black hole for a long time. The planning department, provides direct support. There's somebody there at every single meeting, and any work that has to actually be done is done by people in planning. The other major cost is most every project, few exceptions, needs to get vetted by town council. Some are very easy to do. Historical preservation of houses is difficult to do because you have to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards on, what is maintenance, what is improvement, what is preservation. So there's real costs involved in supporting the CPC. How much the assessors department, gets involved at this point. I mean, the 1.5% has been programmed now for how many years? And it's really just automatic. There's some administration about people who incomes aren't high enough to, or are low enough to be exempted, but it's not a lot of work. So, yeah, I think we ought to support Bill's request and take a look at just where that administrative fee is calculated and whether the spreadsheet can be reduced to 1 sheet, not 7, and have some basis in reality.
Mr. Borden?
Bill, thank you. I think this is probably one of the most comprehensive things that we've had, and I'd like to see something like this maybe every quarter, or, maybe not as much in depth, but one of the things I've been asking for is we're bonded 2 properties, Wright Hill, Piper Lane. I think Piper Lane was one. The last one was, at least. And I asked last chair, where are we within those bond payments, right? Are we in it 3 years, 5 years, whatever? So what was the term of the loan? What was the length of the loan? How many years are we into it? When does it roll off the books? As Steve's department does with all our other bonds. So I'd like to have that presented to the committee to know what we're up against, or what you're up against, I should say. From an accounting perspective, every year they come in and say, okay, we're going to put this money in open space set-aside fund, and then you see money come out of open space set-aside to pay the bond. My thought would be, and I've brought this up before, is why are you doing it that way? You have a bond payment of X. You know what the bond payments is on those 2 bonds. Say it's 50 grand a year. and you got to put $400,000 in open space set aside, and then go to the open space set aside and take out 50,000. Well, give the open space set aside 350,000 and put as a separate article 50,000 for the bond payments. Makes it cleaner for accounting, because they don't have to put money in and pull money back out.
Right.
It's just, it's mechanics, but it's also optics when you bring it to town meetings, so it's easier to follow. I know the committee works very hard at vetting projects, and that's why I like it when the committee doesn't have that, they don't have enough money to cover all the projects that are asked for. It makes the applicant go back and really think, as Jason said, what do we really need? What do we have to do? Maybe their project's overblown. You know, these things happen. We know that. Escalation costs recently with COVID and things like that. I understand project costs are a lot higher than what they were in the past. We've seen that in our own building of our own, facilities here. And we have some big, tough ones coming down the line, so increasing of the surcharge is harder on our seniors in town. And there's a vast majority of people that are retired in our town. I can go to my street and pick up a bunch of people that are retired. And taxes have gone up due, basically the home valuations have gone parabolic, which is ridiculous. But I like owning a house and having your home value higher than what you bought it for and what you owe on it. But, all right, it's good in that aspect of it, but, so it kind of hurts our low income and our seniors and things like that. So it's something that's the committee to consider. And I think you guys are doing a good job, and I really like having this kind of level of detail so we know what we're up against, and, having us vet projects like that, absolutely. You have my contact, I assume, and I've chaired it for 2 years. I was vice chair for 2 years. I was on the CPA study committee to go through to raising the surcharge many years ago. Peter Barry, didn't happen. So
I'll send you the bonding package.
Hmm?
I'll send you the bonding slide set. that
Yeah,
I sent to Adam on Sunday.
I think the committee would like to see that and see where we're at and what's I can't read.
You want to, feel free to share it with the committee, because it's,
see where it's rolling off and that's going down. Obviously, as more projects get added later on.
Oh, yeah.
As Jason said, yeah, it all depends on what's going to happen with interest rates. Nobody knows. The feds are talking raising another 3/4, 75 bips. Great if you're a saver, but if you're bonding something, it's going to negatively impact you. It's going to negatively impact people looking to buy mortgages too. So, but we are getting a lot of new growth in town, so the CPA should be getting more money in the next year or so because of new growth that we've had. And the homes are going for 1.4 million or a million to 1.4, and one of them's going up at like 1.9. So, something we have to also pay attention to as well. So, thank you for coming in.
Yes, Mrs. Anderson.
You said we're not going to talk about the surcharge, the change right now. I have some questions.
famous last words.
For when you do. I would love to see some of the data about how the scale, the size of projects have changed over time. Get an idea if there's been a different median or average size of project that has happened. Is it fewer people coming? You mentioned some really large projects. Are the same people coming back for really big things? Just to understand. Maybe there's been more along the lines of what Steve was saying anecdotally. He feels like he's seen, has there been more of a shift towards the town municipality asking for more funding for large projects?
Right.
Also curious about who is taking part in your 5-year plan.
Everybody I can think of. I haven't thought of everybody. I've been corrected. But the ACHC, the AHA, Habitat for Humanity for the community space, community housing space. Certainly Andy McGee from Open Space. David Hahn and Bill, somebody, I think of his last name. From a historic standpoint.
Clower, yeah.
No,
No?
he's an architect. He's in,
Oh.
He's the, Dickinson, thank you. Appreciate it.
He's not just the IT guy.
Recreation, working through Melissa Ryer, and here I'm trying to get Steve Trimble, the vice chair of our committee, who's our recreation domain lead, to reach out and to make sure that Patina Abbey and the Arboretum source and our town trails and whatnot are represented. But this 5-year plan is because I started in July and we've published, and in 2 weeks' time, we will be reviewing our five-year plan, our CPC plan with the town. It will only include our intent statements that say we will be doing this every year and inputs will be required in June, so that the final document can be included in the CPC plan published in September. It's too late to do that this time around, and it's not a bad thing either, because we're getting the kinks worked out and making sure that I cover the waterfront as close to 100% as I can. Ironwork Farms, I've left them out. I've got to reach out to them. But I have no interest in doing anything but cover the universe. It will not be 100%, but that's okay, because it's just every year we're going to do it over again. And the applications will come in irrespective of whether they were represented initially as a placeholder in the 5-year plan or not, and that's okay. But we do need to get a handle on, so what's the trajectory of the spending going forward as best we can.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Mr. Nan, more?
I was just going to add to what Bill said, Christie. There's always been a requirement in the Community Preservation Act to do an annual plan. And they've been doing it since we adopted the act. What Bill's doing is now actually saying, well, why don't we make it a useful plan and take it out 5 years as opposed to an annual plan, which is kind of like our town budgets. It's 1 year and no look at the horizon at all. So this would be a huge improvement in the planning process that already exists.
Great. So thank you for coming. I'm going to hit you with a few questions, but before I do, I think it looks like Mr. Martin would like to say something.
Can I ask a question?
Do.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Bill, whether you discovered in your research or the CPC members had a preference with regard to large projects for kind of a one and done model or a phased model, right? I've heard different preferences, and I was just wondering if you encountered that.
Not a preference for one over the other. I think the committee is sensitive to the fact that if it's staged over a number of years, there's every likelihood that there's going to be some diseconomies for having done so. One and done is usually the most cost-effective approach. When you stagger it over time, starting and stopping, it has a tendency to create additional expenses that might otherwise been required, that would not have been required. But given the fact that we've had a very, we have a ceiling of about 1.7 million, give or take a bit, we're very sensitive to the fact that, that we can't afford $1 million projects or $850,000 projects in addition to all these other projects. Something's got to give. So the first question that comes to people's minds is, can some of this be staged without creating diseconomies? But I think, I don't think there's a predisposition on anybody's part. We'd love to have sufficient funding to cover them all, but I do think that, to Jason's earlier point, not having enough has forced a level of rigor that I think certain times we may not be as motivated to apply.
Okay, so I have a few questions, and then I'll let you get out of here. With regard to the town that you mentioned brings up a warrant article every year and votes their level of CPA funding. Do you know how that affects the benefits they receive from the state if they change their level of funding year on year? Like 1 year it's 1%, another year it's 3%. Are they still eligible for the extra benefits of the 3% surcharge that year and that year only, or?
I don't know, because I don't know the answer to that question. I am only aware of the fact that it's only the 3% surcharge that gets the additional 6 percentage points of the match, and anything below that gets what everybody else gets, irrespective of whether it's a 1% surcharge or a 2.75% surcharge. But I don't know if you go from, my sense is that they've been revalidating the 3% every year, and it has persisted for quite an extended period, but I'm not 100% sure that's true.
Okay, great. And the reason I asked was because I know that in the conversation at town meeting about whether or not to raise the CPA surcharge, I think the consensus was that, well, if we have other projects that the current surcharge isn't covering, we'll just bring those up as town warrants. Well, in that same regard, maybe you can, that particular year, if you needed it, raise it 3% if there's an extra benefit to be had from the state by raising the CPA surcharge for 1 year or 2 years, rather than just saying, okay, we'll take out a bond, or the town will take out a bond, or the town will take money out of free cash or the general fund. So that's something to consider. And then I had a question about the current bonding with the CPC. That's all paid out of the CPC funding, correct? That's not tied on to the town's debt in any way?
No.
Okay, and then have the schools ever applied for CPC, or are there projects they can have that are eligible for CPC
I
funding?
see Steve nodding his head. That goes back before my time.
Okay, but it's not recently, it sounds like. Okay. All right, and so I suspect probably the most efficient and effective way for us to be beneficial to the CPC with regard to vetting your projects would be to, and it already works, I think, since we meet at the same time on Tuesday evenings, just have a joint meeting. And, you know, as you get closer to the town meeting process, when you have those larger applicants that are coming and giving their presentations to ask for funding, just we'll schedule a joint meeting, and then the FinCom can see the presentation at the same time, and you can decide whether you want us to ask questions or whether you just want us to be there and be present.
I'll bring that back to the committee.
Yeah.
I think the committee wants to be confident that my reaching out to FinCom isn't undercutting their role and responsibility. Sure. The motivation I have here is that I want to make sure the level of financial vetting occurs, you know, in perpetuity, and is not dependent upon the skill set of any of the members of our committee.
Yep.
So
we've done a couple joint meetings with the select board for, you know, things like that, and I think it's certainly a time saver, right, Mr. Martin? It saves both committees some time when they're both seeing the presentation, asking questions at the same time. Go ahead, Mr. Board.
I just confirmed with our esteemed town finance manager, 11/5/2002 is when CPC came in to the town.
Okay,
So it's been 20 years.
20 years.
Coming up on 20 years.
Okay.
So it's been a great benefit to the town in terms of match money. You know, my uncle lives in Milton. Oh, we shut down. We don't want more taxes. And I'm like, I think it was on the CPC at the time. Did you realize how much tax dollars, you know, that you gave up, your town gave up? At that time, I think we were the recipient of over 1.5 million. I think it's much higher than that now. So that's always something to keep in the back of our heads as we look at this, is that we've been the recipient of a lot of dollars that's gone to great use in the town, especially when it comes to affordable housing. And like Sachem Way was a great example of that. And you weren't on the committee then, but if you ever looked at that project, that was one that's highly leveraged of CPA money.
I'm having trouble hearing.
Sachem Way?
Sachem Way? Yeah.
Sorry, I should have taken this off. Sachem Way was a big CPA project that we did, you know, and some of the other ones of the rehabbing affordable housing, where it falls within the guidelines of CPA. And it's been a good benefit to the town.
So there you have it.
Thank you.
Mr. Alesbury, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us, and we look forward to anytime you want to come and give us an update on what you guys are looking at and what kind of projects are in the pipeline. We're always very interested in that.
And do you want to share the bonding package? with
Yeah,
the
I can just
committee, or
forward
do you want me
that.
to send it to him?
You can just send it to the FinCom shell if you like. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly acceptable.
All right, very good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right.
Mind just hitting the microphone? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Okay, so we'll move on to the point of view, which I do believe Mrs. Russell has wrapped up, and I think it's going to be perfect.
It's going to be so amazing. All right, so hold please. Let me just, that's not what I meant to do. I know, it's very exciting. I'm going to share my screen here. And then I'm going to put this in present mode. So here's my plan. Please take notes. My plan tonight is to present this to you as if you are the final audience. I'd like to go all the way through it and then hear your thoughts and feedback. We can nitpick this thing for another 6 months, but we're not going to. So unless it's a really big change, I'm hoping we can be potentially done. If anybody has any objections or if anything obviously major comes up, I will be paying attention to raised hands, but for the most part, I'm just going to present. So here we go. Okay, these are the topics we'll be exploring in this presentation. We will bring each of these items to your attention and then make recommendations from our financial perspective. The key points we would like you to focus on are, 1, our spending is predicted to outpace our revenues within the next 3 years. 2, our town reserves are strong and within DOR guidelines. The AB school district's reserves, which they call excess and deficiency or E&D, are currently below where we would like to see them. Ideally, they would stay above a floor of 3% of their budget. 3, the town has identified many capital needs for the maintenance of town infrastructure that need addressing and come with potentially large price tags. And 4, our taxpayers are feeling the impact of more than just increased tax bills, and we would encourage you to consider all factors when thinking through our spending decisions for FY24 and beyond. Revenue refers to the money that comes into the town in order to cover all of our approved spending. The largest source of revenue comes from us, the taxpayers, in the form of our real estate assessment. By law, that amount can increase by no more than 2.5% plus new growth. This number makes up 86% of the FY23 budget. The next biggest revenue source, at 6.3%, is our debt exclusion. These are tax dollars on top of Prop 2.5 that we all agreed at town meeting to add on to our tax bill to pay for large projects that we weren't able to pay for within the operating budget. This includes projects like the North Acton Fire Station, the new Boardwalk Campus School, updates we made to the public safety facility, etc. The third largest revenue source at 5.1% is called local receipts, which are made up of our excise taxes, meals taxes, permits, etc. And the last two, state aid and town reserves, make up just over 1% each. Last spring, we asked the town, the school system, and Minuteman to give us their best guess estimate on what their expenses would be for the next 3 years, so we could better plan our recommendations. They got back to us with an updated ALG plan of projected costs and revenues. Based on these projections, we have reason to be concerned that without strict cost-saving measures, our expenses will outstrip our revenues within the next 3 years. Please note the title of this slide is Spending Projections. I want to be clear that the entities we're dealing with have given us their best guesses on their budget needs and our anticipated revenues. It's our job to make recommendations based on the information we currently have. At this time, it is clear that the projected increase in the budgets for Minuteman, ABRSD, and the town combine to exceed our revenues. These numbers do not currently include a use of free cash from the town or E&D from the school. As of right now, the school's reserve dollars are much lower than we would like to see them. So for the moment, we don't recommend much coming out of that fund. That recommendation may change when we know more about their turnbacks. On the town side, our recommendation stands that they spend down their reserves no lower than 3% of the overall budget. It is possible that free cash amount would be enough to substantially close the gap for FY24, but it would not be enough to address FY25 and 26. spending changes need to happen as soon as possible to bend the curve back in line with our revenues as currently projected. This is a people-driven town. The majority of our budgeted funds go to pay for our town staff, educators, and administrators. As this is the biggest budget item, and we remain limited by Prop 2.5 in our ability to increase taxes, it is vital that we consider the impact of dedicating over 3/4 of our budget to a fixed 4% increase. By locking in 3-year contracts with these increases, we continue to ensure that the only place to find savings without cutting personnel is to cut all other spending. Last year, the school district made hard cuts to staff in order to bring their budget in line with our available revenues. We have had several years of declining student population, so staff right-sizing is definitely something we think the district should be open to. That being said, we believe long-term financial security depends on budgeting closer to our available revenues, and a fixed 4% increase on 75% or more of our budget makes that very difficult to achieve. These are the things we know and things we're able to assume when looking to our financial future. We know that Minuteman is going to increase by 30% in FY24, 18% in FY25, and 9% in FY26. After that, we can expect Minuteman to level out. These years represent the last set of borrowing we previously agreed to for the construction of the new Minuteman campus, as well as the increased student population from Acton. We know that the Middlesex assessment, which is our retirement fund, is going to increase by roughly 6% year over year until we have fully funded it. This is a payment we must make. It's not optional, and we have to budget accordingly. We assume that health insurance costs will continue to climb. Although the last 2 years the increase was around 10%, the average cost over the past 10 years is closer to 5%. Based on that information, we built a 5% increase into our model, but keep in mind that this is a projection and these numbers can and will change. Once you've accounted for these 3 factors, what's left is the difference between those 3 fixed costs and our projected revenue. Without including free cash or E&D, our budgets for all other operations can only increase by 0.64% in FY24, 1.16% in FY25, and 1.39% in FY26. The numbers would all be impacted by an increase or decrease in the health insurance trust assessment, an increase or decrease in state aid, and our decisions regarding use of reserves. Those factors would only serve to close the gap for this coming fiscal year and would not address long-term concerns regarding spending versus revenue. We strongly recommend all entities work to find long-term, ongoing cost savings in their operating budgets. In line with the Department of Revenue, it is the Finance Committee's policy to keep town free cash reserves between 3 and 5% of the overall budget. This practice ensures we stay in good fiscal standing with the state and maintain our AAA bond rating with Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Previously, budgeting practices had us dedicating free cash dollars to the previous fiscal year's budget with the assumption that turnbacks, which are certified in August well after the budget is approved by town meeting, would replenish our free cash back to a number above our 3% floor. For the past few years, the town has changed the practice to spend no lower than the 3% floor and use the August turnbacks in planning the upcoming year's budget rather than in the previous year's budget. This is a practice we would like to see in the ABRSD budget as well. We recognize that in the past few years, the schools have relied more heavily on E&D use than even they would like to, and we hope that cost-saving measures can be employed to allow a more fiscally desirable reserve position in the future. The third bullet on this slide is in regard to other reserve dollars held by the town and schools. Should we come to a point where discussion of an operating override is necessary, we believe use of these funds should be considered as an alternative or means of mitigation before any override proposal is brought before the taxpayers. Part of our efforts to provide long-term fiscal planning include thinking ahead on items that it would be unrealistically difficult to include in our operating budgets. The town and schools have developed capital improvement plans that identify large projects coming to us over the next 10 or more years. While we can't always know when an expensive HVAC system is suddenly going to quit on us, we can make plans to replace a 40-year-old roof, replace an aging fire truck, or identify the crumbling infrastructure of our DPW facility. These significant projects typically have price tags that would be difficult or impossible to fund inside of our Prop 2.5 revenue stream, and are often paid for with excluded debt or loans we vote to pay for outside of Prop 2.5. As you can see here, the town and schools have some significant needs identified. None of these projects are a guarantee at this time. They haven't been budgeted for, prioritized at a school committee or select board meeting. They have simply been identified by each body as upcoming projects that will need our attention sooner rather than later. We think it's important that both entities are aware of the capital project needs they each have and when they're hoping to pay for them, so we can do our best to not overload our taxpayers. It's also important for you, the taxpayer, to know what needs are out there when making a decision on which projects to support when it comes time to vote at town meeting. This chart represents our current debt service payments of principal and interest per year. These are projects like those listed in the previous slide that were too big to attempt to pay within our operating budget. The entities proposed, and we all agreed, to pay for these projects outside of Prop 2.5. As you can see, we have a large dip in our debt service payments this coming year and another one in FY29. The dip in FY29 brings us back down almost to where we would be if we hadn't funded the Boardwalk campus. These dips would impact the taxpayer by a reduced assessment. As we consider the needs shown on the previous slide, keep in mind that any approved project that isn't funded by grant or some other means would likely add on to this chart for the length of the loan and mitigate or eliminate the expected tax reduction. Future capital projects should be approached with caution. This town has done an excellent job in bringing in state and federal funding to aid us in our large projects. We've used MSBA partnerships for school-related projects, community preservation funds for preservation of historic buildings, development of affordable housing, and the acquisition and development of outdoor recreational facilities, and we tapped Mass DOT money for development of our Kelly's Corner project. This is one of Acton's strengths, and we commend past efforts and encourage the town and schools to continue to find ways to tap these and other resources as we move forward in addressing Acton's needs. We highly recommend both entities do everything in their power to avoid spiking the debt service chart and taxpayer wallets. Now that we've talked about spending, reserves, and capital projects, we'd like to take a second to talk to you about the Acton taxpayer. We have a growing senior population, up from 8.4% in 2010. Just over a quarter of our households have school-age children, and 65% of our budgets go to supporting the school system. These charts are meant to provide a frame of reference when thinking about the people who will be asked to pay for services, both on the school and town side. Acton is clearly a school-centric community, known throughout Massachusetts as an excellent place to raise and educate our young children. It is also known for its history, investment in conservation land, and diverse population. It's important to look at the whole community when deciding which services to emphasize. Cutting too deep into services on the town or school side could drastically change Acton's prominence and character. Spending too heavily could make it difficult for our current residents to remain in this great town. Finding the right balance is the key to our success moving forward. First, let's talk about why there are blank spots on this slide. We used to use median family income because it was available through the DOR and census sites. They have since switched over to reporting median household income instead, so we are slowly transitioning this slide. Now let's talk about what this data means. Median represents the exact middle of all assessments. There is some reasonable debate that average is a better classification of Acton's tax situation, since median is a value that will move around over the years. For our purposes, we are interested in understanding what percentage of our taxpayers' income goes to taxes. The census no longer tracks average household income, so we use median for this purpose. As you can see, more than 10% of our income is dedicated to our tax assessment. Since the census changed the way it reported for FY20, we only have 3 years of data to observe trend lines. Over the next several years, this will give us a better understanding of whether or not we are trending up, down, or holding steady in the percentage of our income we pay in taxes. As you likely know, inflation is at 8.52%. This is well above the long-term average of 3.26%. On the one hand, inflation has led to your home value going up, and if you've got a used car to sell, there's someone out there who will pay you handsomely for it. On the other hand, there have been significant increases in the cost of everyday goods and utilities. leftover supply chain issues related to the pandemic, as well as the impact of the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, have added to cost increases on many everyday products. Residents are also likely to see a large increase in water bills as the water district moves to upgrade their water treatment plant to mitigate the PFAS in our water supply. And for those of you on our sewer lines, you will see an increase to that assessment to cover the cost of repairs to the treatment facility. These factors are not in the control of our budgeting bodies. These are other factors that will impact our residents and chip away at their resources for the foreseeable future. We bring this to your attention because, as we stated before when discussing the capital project slide, we'd like you to consider the taxpayer as a whole when building your budgets and not hyper-focus on your own entities. The $661,506 circled above does not include the proposed use of $1 million in free cash, which would allow for an increase of roughly 1.64% beyond our fixed expenses. This would still leave us with a significant budget gap and would not serve to bend the spending curve to more align with projected revenues. Continued high inflation and healthcare costs will make it that much more difficult for us to maintain services within our revenue stream. Evidence suggests we are at a tipping point in our spending. Although the schools made significant cuts to last year's budgets, we fear that difficult choices will need to be made by all stakeholders if Acton is to remain solvent. This is our conclusion. I didn't write any words to this one. That's it.
Well done. So I would say let's just make this a bit of an open forum. Mr. Cole, why don't you go ahead and start, and then we can work our way this way and come back around to Mr. Borden if he has questions.
I loaded all except for the last word. You can't use the word solvent. We're not about to go bankrupt. So you've got to change that. Everything else was fantastic, but you can't use the word solvent.
Check. No one uses solvent.
Other than that, I'm ready to make a motion to approve, but I'll let everyone else talk first.
Go ahead.
I have two questions.
Yep, go ahead.
On slide 8, I believe we're talking about debt exclusion, and then you said something to the effect as opposed to loans we pay for outside of Prop 2.5. I don't know what that means.
These significant projects typically have price tags that would be difficult or impossible to fund inside of our Prop 2.5 revenue stream and are often paid for with excluded debt or loans we vote to pay for outside of Prop. I was rephrasing.
Yeah, no, that sounded to me like it was a different thing I didn't know about.
Okay, sorry.
And also, on slide 9, you talk about taxpayers getting a reduced assessment.
These dips would impact the taxpayer by a reduced assessment.
Yeah,
Not really a reduced assessment, a reduced tax bill.
tax bill, yeah. Because assessment, for me, assessment, I start thinking about Minuteman and the assessments we get on things like that. And I know you don't want nitpicking about words, but that was the only one I had.
Yeah, on the spending projection slide, you use the term best guess. I wouldn't use guess. I would use best estimate or based on expected trends, or, it's not guesswork. It's a bit more sophisticated. On the current debt service, we all know what the Boardwalk campus is, but as we move out into the community and talk about this, you're going to say New Twin School because it's not commonly known around town. On the capital recommendations, you termed MSBA. Again, we all know what it is. Depending on the audience, they wouldn't just define it. Same thing on taxpayer real estate assessment. You use the term DOR. We all know what the DOR is, but most people will, but they may not know it in that context. So just nitpicking, but now I'll shut up and say it was a good job.
Well, so I have that brings a question that I'd like to ask you, Mr. Noon. Do you think it's more important for us to define that in advance or wait and see if somebody raises it as a question?
It depends on your audience. If you're talking to the school committee, the board of selectmen, I wouldn't think any of these things would come up as a question. If you're talking to PTSOs or the Rotary or something like that, I would expect nobody would know what these terms meant.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Majors.
A couple of things. One, you don't talk about the role of ARPA funding that we'll get this year. I think it could be significant. I think you said a recession is possible. I think we have to admit that a recession is here today. And in your dialogue, it wasn't in the notes, but in your dialogue, you talk about the role of, like, Russia having an impact on gas prices and things of that nature, but I think you also have to acknowledge the role of the federal government basically sabotaging this economy as well. Energy policy and immigration, everything else. You could, I think, pinpoint directly to Washington.
For gas prices? For gas prices?
Right.
So gas prices are the way they are because during the pandemic, the price of oil went down to $0 for crude. And a lot of drilling sites and refineries went offline because there was no need to run them. And then when the pandemic ended, everything went right back to a more normal usage. And all of these refineries are coming back online slowly. They take manpower and it takes time.
We're using strategic oil reserves to
As all these refineries come
moderate
back online,
gas prices.
the price is going down.
We're
as they come
buying
back on.
oil from third world countries and countries that are our enemy, while our oil fields lie barren.
I'm going to argue with that one. The type of crude that we produce is not what is usable and cannot be turned into our gasoline. It's useful in South America, but not here in the U.S.
None of this belongs in our point of view.
This is not the purview of the Acton Finance Committee.
No, I'm not making political statements in the point of view.
Okay. Anything different, Mr. Majors, or anything else? Okay, Mr. Borden, anything? Okay. I have some questions. I have a long list. I'm just kidding. It's not that long.
Out of order.
On the labor slide, I think it was the second or third slide, we point out that the labor increases at 4% per year. You know, how that impacts the budget. Should we also add to that commentary the Middlesex and the HIT and all those other costs that are well above the 2.5% to 3.5%, just so that we're not singling out entities? I know we changed some of our language to not single out Minuteman.
I mean, that's here on this slide.
Okay.
It comes later. It's
Okay,
clearly
that's
there
fine.
later.
I just wanted to see if we wanted to soften that at all. Do we have a dollar amount benefit of the conclusion of the Parker Damon debt on the average tax bill, or no? Do we have a fingertip number? Because I'm sure someone's going to say, oh, that's going to affect my tax bill by how much? I foresee that as a question. So if we don't know that answer, I guess we better find it.
We can get that answer and just have it
Okay.
for when somebody asks.
Great. And then on the fiscal year 24 summary slide, I just want to make sure I'm very clear on the top three big ticket items. So right now, our ALG
Here,
sheet, our ALG process
as
and
big as I can get it.
plan is showing, what did we say, a 2.4 million deficit, which then reduces by $1 million when we spend $1 million out of free cash.
Let's give us a $1.4 million.
So I'm confused what the 661 is, and I don't know why I'm confused about what this number is or what it means to me.
So the top line.
Somebody walk
The
me
top
through
line,
this.
the top line is straight up last year times 1 to 2.5.
Yep.
The next line is what's already completely cooked, baked in, can't be changed. The HIT, Minuteman, the other things that cannot be changed.
Okay, and so then we're saying the 661 is what's left.
Is what's left. And the ALG plan is different because on the ALG plan, they've come back with way more than 661,000
We asked them,
in revised.
what is your real budget increase supposed to be?
But
Yes, that
also on the
part I get.
town side and the ALG plan, they've included the fall off of debt service in their increase.
Well, not at the most recent ALG. They fixed that. Mr. Barrett changed that.
I don't have those numbers.
Yep.
So that's why you're going to see a
This is
difference.
just to show that that all that's left for this coming year is $661,000. If we were at an absolute level, nothing, no change from last year. A 0% increase from last year. And they're going to come back at 3.25 and 3.75 and blow it out of the water.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So-
you may just want to put a percent on that 661.
The percentage is right, it's 0.64%.
Okay.
It's on that bottom right, and it's in the graph
So
earlier.
less than 1%
Yeah.
for everything else.
So I think the reason I'm struggling with this is because I'm too in tune with the ALG spreadsheet and forecast, and those are the numbers that I've got baked into my head. So this is like, where is this coming from? So thank you for explaining that.
Sure.
But it brings me to the question of which is the better way to explain it. Do we want to explain it from an ALG perspective and use those numbers, or do we want to explain
Nope.
it this way?
I will say that
Everybody's pointing at this.
I will say that
Okay.
this has gone to Brian and Mr. Barrett.
Yep.
And I asked them, and the data behind it, the Excel spreadsheet I created based on the ALG numbers, and I asked them to let me know, please, if there were any errors, because I was hoping.
So using
So-
the historical, the school gets 2/3, the town gets 1/3. The school can have $400,000 and the town can have $200,000.
Plus use of reserves, and maybe our revenues will be higher.
Okay. Christine, thank you so much for all the hard work that's gone into this and to everybody else who's helped out. And Mrs. Anderson, do you have another question?
Just to be super clear, that 2.66% increase in revenue is not inclusive of the projection of growth, correct?
No, it includes growth.
Okay.
It includes the.
So that number is the same as what we'd see on the
ALG.
ALG spreadsheet?
That's
Oh,
from
okay, wow.
Yeah, no, it's worse than you think. Motion to approve.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Any abstentions?
Hold for a second. Wait,
Okay.
not an abstention, just hold for a second. Would you review the vote, please? Would you announce the vote?
I believe we had a unanimous aye. No nays and no abstentions. Thank you. All right, we can move on to FinCom business. Yep, and I see Mr. Cadillac's hand is up. Mr. Cadillac, do you have a question?
Not getting into the specifics, but I want to say the last few years have been relatively easy. Low inflation, COVID, federal money, and all this. So there really hasn't been much controversy or various people trying to get more money. That's going to change. You, the Finance Committee, will play a very important role in keeping this town financially sane. There is going to be pressure for you to support overrides. Your first slide says you don't support overrides. There's going to be proposed overrides and pressure for the Finance Committee to support it. Now, without details, I don't say any more. But you will play a pivotal role this year and the following years on what's going to happen to this town financially. I think it's unlikely that people will impose additional taxes by approving overrides. We don't have numbers, so can't really be specific. But I just can't imagine people voting, $1,000 increase permanent for their tax bill. There are people in this town who can afford it, and there are a lot of people in this town who cannot. So we'll see. But what I would urge you to do is to look ahead beyond this year to see where this country is going financially. The, interest rate number came out again, was supposed to drop down to 8.1%. It's 8.3, which doesn't seem like a big deal. But the point is, inflation is not going away. The big unknown, to say it one more time, is the contract with the teachers' union, which takes half of the town revenue. I have no predictions, but I doubt very much that the teachers' union will settle for some nominal amount they never have before. And the approval is entirely up to the school committee. And that hasn't been too successful in past years. So there are potentially severe problems. Question, is your point of view going to be available online so I can download it? That'd be great.
The answer is yes, and my question would be, when will we have it available? We just need to finalize the commentary for the last slide. That doesn't need to be voted in any way, is that right?
I can send you I'll send you a copy right now.
Great.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question?
Mr. Cole?
So, Mr. Cadillac, you had the privilege of being the first member of the public to see this presentation by the privilege of being the only one to show up. Would you agree with my assessment that this is one of the tightest and most pointed point of views that we put together over the last 6 years?
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me just say, I can't read all the numbers that show up on the screen. You have it on your laptop. That's why I need a copy.
We look forward to disseminating this as widely as we can.
In general, I think, the answer to your question is yes. I'm looking forward to Mr. Barrett's numbers coming up at next ALG meeting. That's going to be interesting. So, anyway, my point, I think, without repeating myself, you, the Finance Committee, are going to be a very important part of what happens to this town financially. I am sure you're up to it.
Thank you, Mr. Cadillac. Mr. Noon?
I would just point out that, Christine, I was timing you, and the delivery of it took 14 minutes, which I believe would be a record for delivery of a point of view from the Finance Committee. And as Jason pointed out, it was full of good material.
It was tight, it was to the point, and it was, in my opinion, the most succinct and at the same time most direct that we've ever been.
Okay. So on that, I think it's probably a good time to talk about, I had sent all of you a meeting availability request for a tri-joint meeting. Unfortunately, as soon as I sent that out, I got to hold the phone. We need a different date, so I have not gotten back to any of you. I think right now what we're looking at is October, was it 25th, I believe, which is a normal FinCom meeting night for us. So if none of you are opposed to that, I said that's probably good for all of us. And it's supposed to be a meeting not just with the select board and school committee from Acton, but also and FinCom as well, from Boxborough. And I believe this was requested by the school as a meeting. Go ahead. And we will be expected to deliver our point of view.
Are we actually going to do that? Because the last time I went to a tri-board meeting, we never presented anything. We just sat there.
We are being asked to present our point of view.
I would recommend that we go first.
Okay, we could ask.
And demand that, because last time we didn't do that. We didn't give our point of view. And it ended up being a waste of time for us on FinCom to sit there, especially if you had to come all the way from work, go right to the FinCom meeting, and it was pointless.
Okay.
So I just want to have you recommend that or demand that we go first.
Demand it.
demand it. We're the finance committee, we're going to go first. End of story.
Great, I'll pass that on as Roland's comments.
Yeah.
No, we'll ask.
And it wasn't me. It wasn't me this time.
You can tell that I am requesting that we go first this time,
Okay, wonderful.
and voice my concern.
Yeah,
Please.
that's perfectly fine. You all got my update from last night's select board meeting. Mr. Martin reached out to me today and asked if he could speak to us tonight about some of the plans for the upcoming hearings to talk more about ARPA. So, Mr. Martin, if you're ready, now is probably as good a time as any.
Thank you. Just very briefly, the select board last night had a listening session just to get people's requests, if you will, for ARPA funding. We did that. We didn't have anything written. The town manager also said a number of projects that he thought would be worthy of ARPA funding. Today, I spoke with the town manager and encouraged him to get the input in written form, which I think was emailed to you guys just before the meeting. That is not 100%. Yeah, it was rushed a little bit to get it available to you guys. I know it wasn't on your agenda, but to get to you guys tonight so that you'd have time to consider it before your next meeting. I expect that, I'm not exactly sure of the form next time, but I asked the chair during the meeting last night, and possible we may vote at our next meeting, which would be one day before our next meeting is October 3rd. So we'll have a meeting to discuss this. So, the one thing I know that's missing from the list sent to you this afternoon is a capital request for repaving the parking lot for Town Hall for $600,000, I think. So that's all I wanted to mention. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or to attempt to answer them.
In your opinion, Mr. Martin, do you think we should quickly go through this list?
I don't think that's necessary tonight. I think it's important if you, like last time, if you want to make recommendations to the select board, that they be available beforehand, before our next meeting, which is October 3rd, and like last time, one of you guys could say, or I'm happy to say what the FinCom recommendation is for each thing that we consider. I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment. There are $10 million worth of requests and $2 million worth of money.
And our next FinCom meeting is scheduled to be the 27th, which will be the week right before. So be sure to put that on the agenda. Oh, I'm sorry. Our next meeting is the 27th, and that's the week before you meet, so we'll be sure and put this on the agenda for our next meeting. Thank you, Mr. Martin, for that update. I would add to that it seemed to me from the listening session last night that it was the majority of the requests are sort of either extensions or re-requests of previous requests, right? There's not a lot of new, not a whole lot of new requests, just a couple, at any rate. Any other liaison reports from folks? Anybody? Mrs. Russell?
From the schools committee side, just to confirm that JD Head's moving on to the operation manager at Fitchburg State University. The school is not planning to backfill his position. They're going to just farm out his responsibilities and see if they can get by without that position. The school building project's on budget. They are awaiting some asbestos remediation reports on the demolition of the other two buildings. But it seems to be going along well and opened and had a great start to the school year. Other than that, the school has experienced a 10% teacher turnover, which is not atypical across the country. It's interesting. I fully believe we have a problem being able to support continued 4% salary increases for teachers. I also know that the education system is suffering extreme lack of people and available people, and a lot of moving around due to post-pandemic burnout, but a lot of people leaving teaching as well. So it's going to make things really interesting in the next couple of years.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the update I sent, did I include the date for the planned open house of the twin school?
I think I have it.
I
think you
can't
did.
remember what the date was off the top of my head, and I just quickly looked at all the Saturdays and Sundays in my October calendar, and I didn't see it in there, and I thought I had put it in my calendar, but I just wanted to make sure that I had sent it.
October 15th at 9:30.
Okay, so I just hadn't put it in my calendar when I thought that I had.
No, I'm sorry, that's the tri-board meeting schedule,
that-
so I have that wrong.
Okay, at any rate, it's
find
coming
it.
up. We'll keep an eye out for it. I'm sure you will all want to attend. I know I will. Tonight, the planning board is having a joint meeting with the town of Maynard Planning Board to talk about my mind just went blank. What is our project down there at South Powder Mill? Thank you. So I had asked John Mangiarotti if we could get a recording of that so that I could watch that tomorrow. So once I know the results of that meeting, I will inform you all by email. I will accept one more motion.
Can I ask you a quick question about that?
Sure.
So I thought that Maynard had decided to pull out of the Powder Mill project. Did they re-decide?
Mr. Martin might have more
Sorry.
information about that.
Because it was both towns and then it was just Acton. Is it back to both,
I-
or is this a different project?
I'm pretty sure that discussion is about the Route 62 corridor project, not about Powder Mill Place.
Okay.
Oh, the
Okay.
email I got said it was about Powder Mill, so
Okay.
my apologies.
Thank you.
Okay, good question. And I'll get you guys an update tomorrow. So I'll accept another motion.
Move or adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Any abstentions? All right, thank you very much.